Good afternoon, everyone. Today's hangout for eNCA.com is going to look at monetary policy. We're going to be looking at the role of the Reserve Bank. I think this is a timely discussion given that last week we had Kganyago announce his first interest rate decision as the governor of the Reserve Bank and as chair of the Monetary Policy Committee. So we thought it would be just a good time to get a group of people together and to reflect on what this means. Of course, this is a hangout platform, so it's more lively and less formal than a studio interaction. And we also have people on eNCA.com joining and watching as we talk, and this will be available afterwards. I'm going to start first by just asking for a brief introduction from everyone on who's actively participating in the hangout. I'm going to start. I'm Trudi. I'm resident economist here at eNCA, and I also contribute to eNCA.com. I'm going to start with Yashodan. Could you just give a brief 1 minute or even 10-second overview of who you are, what you do?
Sure. My name is Yashodan Naidu. I'm the Chief Project Manager at J&J Group. It's a diversified investment company.
Thank you. Can we go to Kenneth?
My name is Kenneth Creamer. I'm an economist at Wits University, where I teach macroeconomics and do some macroeconomics research.
Thank you. Arnold?
My name is Arnold Wentzel. I teach education, economic education and monetary economics at the University of Johannesburg.
Thank you. At some point, we might also have Thando Sibisi joining us, who is a student at UJ, and also Chris Madikani, who's an economics lecturer at Wits, but they might join us during the conversation. So I think maybe just starting on the big question really about the Reserve Bank. It's got a wide mandate in terms of managing inflation, monitoring the exchange rate, and intervening where appropriate, also looking at financial stability and regulating financial markets. But perhaps starting with the core of it all, inflation and inflation targeting. Does South Africa have the right approach to monetary policy? Is this something that has worked for us, that will continue to work well for us? I'll start with you, Kenneth.
All right, well, thanks for starting with me. I will have to think about that. I would say in a nutshell that South Africa has got a flexible inflation targeting regime. One of the important moments after it was adopted in about the year 2000 was the moment when the Minister of Finance at the time, Pravin Gordhan, wrote a letter to the Reserve Bank and kind of widened the mandate and made it explicitly a more flexible regime, which was probably more likely to take place after the credibility had been built up in the inflation targeting framework. So I would say it has served South Africa well. Many of the critics of inflation targeting allege that it would cause interest rates to be too high and would slow down growth. But in fact, on average, the interest rates have been lower during inflation targeting than they were before inflation targeting, and the growth has been higher during this period than it was before inflation targeting, empirically speaking. But there's still challenges globally. The inflation targeting framework is constantly being reviewed, and there are some blind spots in the framework which could lead to bubbles and financial instability. But we can talk more about that later. That wasn't really your question. I think your question is it a good framework? I think it has served South Africa fairly well.
Okay, thanks, Kenneth. Yashodan, I'm going to come to you next. I mean, you've heard that, we've had lower interest rates. Growth has performed once again better than before the framework. I mean, from your perspectives as a business person, investor, how do you feel about this framework and its impact in the way that it's been implemented in South Africa?
Well, I think the more broad question that you need to ask is what is the objective beyond just inflation targeting or economic growth? And that is to lift the quality of life of all South Africans. For investors, it's a separate question. It's how do we have an environment that provides a return on capital, but you're human first, I would say investor second. And within a framework of a market economy, having a discussion that's very narrow around the Reserve Bank's mandate and role, it's kind of like being on a lifeboat in the middle of the ocean with a hole in it, talking about how best to distribute food. It's an important conversation, but maybe being in the lifeboat in the middle of the ocean is a more pressing issue. So I think this dichotomy between targeting and economic growth leads to the idea of, well, is there going to be job creation? But economic growth doesn't lead to job creation, it leads to wealth creation. And wealth consolidates into the have capital. So it's really just a false question, because yeah, you can get economic growth, but if the government's mandate is to create better quality of life for all the citizens, then it's more broadly than just these stopgap measures wherever possible.
Okay, so in a way, you would argue for a more broader approach or better ways to measure whether we're making progress or not beyond the growth framework. In a sense, you'd want, is it that you want more expensive ways of measuring our progress?
Yeah, I think you'd have to adopt an attitude of radical change, because progress in the economic system that we are in is always going to benefit a very narrow minority. And if you're an investment banker or an investing class, you are in that minority, but it's not going to trickle down. You're going to see a real consolidation of it. Any entrepreneur will tell you that you will not hire one more employee than is required to generate the profit needed for that business to grow. So I would say the conversation centers around totally radical change, because otherwise you're just measuring 1 centimeter at a time when you're saying, well, it's not going to really do much. And I think for new democracies like ours, or for established democracies like England, you will find the same issues happening, because this is the fundamental heart of it, is that this is a very bad economic system for humans. It's good for investment, but it's bad for people. So I encourage that kind of discussion.
Okay. No, I hear you. So we'll get back to you on that about radicalism when we start perhaps also looking forward to the future. But let me get to Arnold. Your thoughts on monetary policy framework, particularly inflation targeting or flexible inflation targeting.
I would probably place myself somewhere between Kenneth and Yashodhan. Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, once said that inflation is one of the dirty little secrets of economics. He said that we kind of think that we are told that inflation is always harmful, but in reality the costs of inflation have been inflated and has not been confirmed in academic studies. I mean, even people like Joseph Stiglitz, who also won the Nobel Prize, found that inflation only becomes harmful at really levels like 30–40%. I'm not sure if that's the case in South Africa, but clearly sometimes we overinflate the dangers of inflation, and as Yashodhan says, we always have to ask ourselves who benefits. And our politics students they get good practice in this. Whenever you have an argument, the first question you ask is who benefits? And who benefits from inflation targeting, and especially low inflation? It is not the normal man or woman in the street often. It's the investors, the bondholders more often. So these are things that I think we need to consider when we evaluate whether inflation works. I think inflation is an important indicator in the economy. It does indicate the health, and it does indicate whether we're dealing with excess capacity or whether we're trying to live above our means. But I think we shouldn't overestimate its benefits, or benefits of inflation control all the time.
Okay. Kenneth, I'm going to come back to you on picking up on that point. The sense that we might be inflating the cost of inflation and that perhaps it's not as costly as we think. And perhaps when you answer, I'm thinking, should we be thinking of alternatives, the obvious ones that's been presented as a greater focus on employment, for instance? Is that perhaps a better way to think about this? Have we overemphasized the focus on inflation?
Well, I'll try and answer that one. When I teach my students about inflation, I have a very similar approach to that of Arnold, really, in the sense that you don't want too much inflation and you don't want too little inflation. It's just like Goldilocks. It has to be just right. Because if you have too much inflation, it's very destructive to the economy. And if you have deflation, particularly falling prices, we can see the dangers in Europe at the moment, the kind of problems that deflation can cause. So we need to get a situation where the inflation rate doesn't go too high, and some of the theory says, well, if it starts going over 10, 15%, then it's likely to go higher faster because the expectations grow. So the role of the Reserve Bank is really, it's quite a narrow, as Yashodhan says, it's quite a narrow focus because there are many parts of economic management. And we're just talking today about the management of the money supply, the interest rates, and that's all. You know, we're not talking about structural factors, labor market factors, electricity supply, the ports. We're just talking about one package here, which is the inflation targeting, which is the mandate of the authorities that are controlling the money supply. And I think their job is to keep that stability. And as Arnold says, who benefits? The investment benefits if you are able to bring that stability. But then the question to Arnold is that who benefits from the investment? You know, it's not like it's bad if there's investment, because then you get jobs and you get growth and all of those things. So it's a contribution to investment that you keep inflation at the right Goldilocks level, not too high, not too low. And that's the mandate that our authorities have.
Okay. But as a follow-up on that, then let's say you wanted to keep it not too high, not too low, some form of moderation. Now let's look at an economy like South Africa, new democracy emerging, highly unequal. Is 3 to 6% the right approach? Should we have a wider band? Should it be reviewed regularly? We haven't really had much debate, to be honest, about the actual band itself. Any thoughts on that? I'll start with you, Kenneth, and go around on thoughts on the band that we're targeting.
I'm not sure. Let Arnold start with that one. I'm not sure.
Okay, Arnold?
I think there's some good arguments to be made that the range might be too low. I know that the Reserve Bank, the way they argue it is they say, let's look at the range in South Africa compared to similar inflation targeting countries, and our range seems to be higher on average than them. But I think the real question is, what is the minimum point at which you want to set the range? You want to set the range at the minimum point where you start gaining control over price increases. And with a country where there's a very highly oligopolistic market structure, there's a lot of administered prices in our economy, prices over which the Reserve Bank has very little control. You have to ask yourself, can it really control anything below 3%, or does its control only start kicking in at about 6% or above 9%? So I think there are too many uncontrollables in the South African economy to argue that a rate of 3% is like the minimum range for an inflation target in South Africa.
And on the other end, should we perhaps be a bit more relaxed about inflation and say 10% is not a train smash?
Well, yeah, as I said, I mean, if you take into account the dirty little secret, as Paul Krugman called it, inflation, you know, it does have harm, but is the harm really that bad? If we pursue it at the cost of more beneficial objectives. So I mean, some people have argued 6 to 9, and I think there's some strong arguments to be made for 6 to 9 or 6 to 10, perhaps.
Yashodhan, do you have anything to add to that discussion around your thoughts on the actual band that we're targeting?
Well, I agree with Arnold's point that the Reserve Bank doesn't have any tool besides the repo rate adjustment in its arsenal to deal with inflation, and there's so many other factors that come into play as well. Energy supply, price of fuel coming into South Africa, all of those things can really change all their goals and hopes. Again, it comes back to, you mentioned South Africa's new democracy, and it's grossly unequal. I think we're the second or third most unequal country in the world. What is the purpose of inflation targeting, right? And who does it benefit? And what type of country do you want to run? Do you want to have a country where a political class is well funded by a group of individuals and a narrow elite that says you serve our interests, which happens in most democracies after time? So please ensure that we can have an economy that functions to serve our investments, so we are able to have job growth, company growth that can be used to generate a return on our capital. Then yeah, fine. There's no issue with that. But I think that most people in South Africa who vote for the government would say that's probably not the right priorities to have, and they should align themselves more closely with what is in the interest of the vast majority of people, as opposed to a nice, neat, financially lucrative portion of the population.
Okay, Arnold, do you want to come back on that? Okay, no, I looked like you wanted to say something.
No.
Okay. I mean, I think, we've spoken quite a bit about the inflation targeting. In a sense, we're more or less agreeing that you want to regulate inflation, but you don't want to be excessive about it or to overestimate its costs. And also, I think Yashodhan has made some interesting points about the broader point of having even this whole debate in terms of the economic system that we have that might be certain interests above others. I wanted to move slightly away from that and look at the other aspects of the Reserve Bank's mandate, especially around financial stability. Because we're very proud of our financial sector and how we avoided, in some senses, the financial crisis and the excessive, unsecured lending that occurred in other markets. But I suppose with African Bank, having happened, we can be a bit more humble about our financial stability. I mean, Kenneth, what are your thoughts on the way that the Reserve Bank executes that mandate of regulating banks? And also, not only are they careful enough, but could they be too careful in the sense of also letting in other people into the banking system?
Yes, well, I think that if you look at it historically, the mandate of the central banks has changed over the decades. During what you might call the Keynesian or the high Keynesian period of the 1950s and 60s, the Reserve Bank's mandate was very much about stimulating demand, stimulating growth. Then during the monetarist revolution, it became about controlling the money supply as a primary objective, because the insight from Friedman was that the government was actually causing instability through its Keynesianism, and was therefore, if they could just control the money supply and grow it at 5% every year, that would be its contribution to stability. And then it evolved to inflation targeting, where it was felt, no, the Reserve Bank, the central banks of the world should just focus their interest rate instruments on controlling inflation, and that would be good for investment and stability and growth. And I think, Trudi, you're putting your finger now on the new wave of it's a change in the mandate that we could be seeing for the central banks, where increasingly all over the world, and even in South Africa, the central banks are being told that their job is not only inflation targeting, which is good for growth, so it's a kind of implicit dual mandate, but it's explicitly inflation targeting, but also this question of banking regulation and macro stability as a core objective. So suddenly the grey-haired central banker has got more responsibilities now, because he or she has to also start developing insight into whether there is macro-prudential stability in the economy. And it is about banking regulation, you're quite right. The collapse of the banking system in in the US and in Europe, particularly in the US, caused a lot of problems with the loans and people who couldn't afford to pay back their loans. But it's also on things like detecting bubbles that might be occurring. So, for example, if housing prices are going up, I read one paper where they're saying, well, then the instruments should include things like increasing property taxes so as to slow down. If you're going to be buying a house, you must pay more on your transfer duties in order for, because then you wouldn't use the interest rate instrument there, you'd have new instruments to try and subdue that bubble. Interesting, Stiglitz, who was quoted earlier, his criticism of inflation targeting in the US was not that it was high interest rates. No. The interest rates were too low in the US for too long. And that caused the bubble. And because they weren't focused on this macroprudential regulation, there was no authority in the US system to detect that bubble, and there were no instruments aimed at deflating that bubble. And these are this new wave of mandate now that we're being told, no, well, you need to also look at the overall instability and that's emerging in the economy. And it's a big challenge for the central banks. And I think it's one that the South African Bank is beginning to look at. I think this African bank collapse is a big wake-up call. And the question of consumer debt that we often hear about, the consumer is in debt. It's a bit like a subprime situation, you know, and our authorities are going to have to start turning their attention. I would imagine that's a secondary mandate under inflation targeting. But if the paw hits the fan, people are going to look at the monetary authorities and the Reserve Bank and say, well, why were you sleeping at the wheel? You know, this is your responsibility. And I think they are waking up to the fact that they can't hide behind an inflation targeting mandate.
Okay, thanks, Kenneth. I think that's a lot to think about, and very much, as you say, very new challenge that central banks the world over have to look at. Yeah, Sean, I'll come to you. You also wanted to have some thoughts on banking regulation in general, but I suppose also the way one should approach it in South Africa.
I think the challenge with banking regulation is that you've got two sets of players on these different sides. One on the public sector side, and their job is to try and regulate increasingly complex financial instruments. And then on the private sector side, people who are actually devising and creating these fairly complex financial instruments. Kenneth mentioned the bubble, the property crisis in the US, and that happened largely because the rating agencies, Moody and the like, didn't have the capacity to understand these complex debt instruments that were being created by the very companies that they were rating AAA. Also, part of that issue is with any rating agency, you get paid by the company that you're supposed to rate. So it's similar to if your employer says you need to rate me, but your any future payments will also depend largely on how you rate me. So that's a bit of an issue in South Africa. Unsecured lending and what may still come is going to really be a battleground for how good the regulators will be. And if the best and the brightest get hired into private sector away from the government or governmental departments, then what you'll find is that they'll be outmatched and outgunned, and they will not be able to regulate efficiently or effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a general regulatory problem in many industries and in many cases where the industry does move faster than the regulator. And I think that is an important consideration, especially in a small market where I suppose skills are also not as readily available. But on the subject of skills, actually, I suppose one thing we haven't really touched on so far is, of course, the fact that the Reserve Bank has a new leader, Kganyago, who was deputy before and who also came from the Treasury where he was DG. And I suppose just the question around his performance last week, it was his first monetary policy statement. Luckily, he didn't have to change anything. Things stayed the same. But first, any thoughts, maybe starting with you, Arnold, on Kganyago's track record, his appointment, what it represents?
I think Kganyago's appointment simply indicates that we're going to see a continuation of the same kind of economic philosophy, the very much the conventional orthodox economic thinking. And then he came through Treasury, where he was obviously in touch with people like Trevor Manuel and Maria Ramos, who were very, very conventional ideas about how the economy works and how to manage it. And so inflation targeting would have been part of that package. So in terms of giving confidence to international investors and sticking to the script of conventional economics, is certainly very well qualified, and I think is a good choice if that's what you want. But I suppose if you're wanting fresh thinking, new ideas, then you probably would want to look at somebody else. But I mean, he's very solid and he's very knowledgeable, in my opinion. So far so good, I would say.
Okay, so far so good. Kenneth, any thoughts?
I think he's quite a lucky governor, because he's taken the reins at a time when the inflation situation seems to be benign. The oil price is coming down very sharply. It's very surprising given the geopolitical situation in the world, but they're talking about the US producing oil for itself now and being less reliant on other parts of the world, and the oil price is really coming down. And the shale gas input has also caused quite a... And so he's lucky in that sense. And then there's talk, if I read the statement that he made, he also believes that the food inflation is fairly benign. And obviously, food inflation really hurts the poor, because the largest portion of their monthly salary or wage or income that they have is often spent on food. So in that sense, I think he hasn't come into the job at a time when it's very difficult. I think he's going to have a few months to find his feet, and maybe as the year comes next year, it won't be so difficult in terms of inflation rising. Possibly the challenge he will face will be when the US continues with begins to increase its interest rates next year, because that'll cause the interest rate cycle globally to start to rise, as they come to the end of the QE. And as they say, I suppose monetary policy starts to normalize in the US. And at that point, then he's going to have to make some interesting decisions, because if the US interest rate rises, then the South African interest rate should also rise. If it doesn't, then there's a strong possibility that we will have a currency depreciation. And the question is, how much do we want the currency to depreciate to be competitive? Can we retain that competitiveness, or will it just cause inflation, and then that competitiveness in real terms will disappear? So I think that might be a philosophical challenge for him. As I agree that it's much as business as usual, but it's business. The individual is business as usual, but the kind of challenges that he faces will require him him and his committee members to think for themselves, and to think about their philosophy. Stiglitz recently said that the interest rate is less important to companies than the exchange rate, for example. And that exchange rate is another element of the monetary policy that we haven't discussed much today, but which is key and which they do have a major influence over.
Thanks, Kenneth. Sheldon, coming back to you, just reflecting on Kganyago's first statement and the symbolism of, I suppose, a candidate who very much represents continuity. What's your take on that?
I would agree. I think he's a consistent candidate, but do you really want more of the same? This is a very narrow band, and I know that your news network has given you a mandate to talk about this particular topic over this 30 minutes or 45 minutes. But the status quo, having consistency like this, is not beneficial. It's really not that beneficial to everyone but maybe myself and some colleagues of mine and a small band of individuals. It's not that beneficial to have that as to say that, yes, let's keep it consistent, and people are protesting and lighting everything on fire. It is consistent, and it does bring investor confidence, and you will get people coming, both companies locally, internationally, saying, okay, this is comfortable, this is good, this guy is a safe bet, But anytime you have a safe bet when the world is on fire, it's not a great idea. So my suggestion is that they could have found someone who was as skilled. I think it's difficult under this administration to find someone who's radical and skilled. So, you know, it's a bit of this and a bit of that.
Interesting. Hard to find someone who's radical and skilled. I think Thando has joined us for this hangout. Thando, are you with us? Okay, I think we'll get back to Thando. Thando is a student at UJ, and of course it would have been interesting to hear from the perspective of someone who's not quite, who's still studying this from a bit of a distance, but I'll come back to her. But on that point, I suppose perhaps we can move a bit in two directions. One on the exchange, because as Kenneth mentioned, it is also something that obviously it's the instruments that it has at its disposal and just its ability to buy and sell currency that the central bank has a great influence on. And Arnold, perhaps if I come back to you on that, on the exchange rate, we have a vexed debate in South Africa. Is it too strong? Could it be weak? But if it's weakened, would manufacturing come to the table, for instance? Would exports come to the party? I mean, what are your thoughts on the relationship between monetary policy and the way that it's influenced the exchange rate and where, even the difficulties that the rand is at now in terms of volatility?
Yeah, I agree with Kenneth that exchange rate, I think, is more important to an economy than the interest rate. The question of whether the exchange rate is too weak or the level is too weak or too strong, I think presupposes that you can control the exchange rate, and that is where I maybe differ. I think the research shows that most of the theories that the Reserve Bank uses to explain their decisions regarding the exchange rate have been shown not to be true. The theory of interest rate parity, which says that the relative interest rate of a country determines its exchange rate, has been shown, that relationship has been shown to be weak. And similarly, the relationship between inflation through purchasing power parity, that theory and its effect on the exchange rate is also shown to be too weak. And the Reserve Bank really doesn't have the reserves to be able to intervene in the foreign exchange market at all times. So, I mean, in South Africa, the exchange rate is highly volatile, and myself, I'm uncertain as to whether we can really do something about it. We can certainly create the impression that we can, but whether that impression is actually something that can materialize, I don't believe so.
Okay. Kenneth, back to you on that. Any response on the exchange rate and how we've managed it? Perhaps even broader than the Reserve Bank itself, just in terms of other instruments that could have been brought to bear.
Yes, I think that the Reserve Bank is going to be responsible for inflation targeting, macroprudential management, and increasingly the exchange rate is going to be, the conversation about those factors will be more explicit than it has been. That's my prediction for the next few years. I think that there's a lot of pressure from South African industry. The industrial base feels that it has become uncompetitive for a number of reasons. Obviously, the electricity supply, the labor costs, but the exchange rate, when the rand gets strong, it does make it difficult for South Africa to export. And there's a lot of pressure also from within government circles, the DTI, those responsible for promoting South African trade and industry and exports, have made a very strong case for the fact that the exchange rate must be more stable and must be more competitive to assist us in our industrialization effort. But it isn't an easy thing. As Arnold says, the literature is not decisive, but I think what is coming clearer now is that we should be seeking to manage our exchange rate rather than just let it float freely. And what tools would we use to manage that exchange rate? We're not going to try and fix it. If the exchange rate comes under attack and it starts to weaken very, very much, there's no point in trying to defend it, because we saw during the Asian crisis that $30 billion was lost in a very short time by the Reserve Bank trying to defend the currency. But there is a scope when your exchange rate is getting too strong. It's an asymmetrical thing. When it's getting weak, there's no reserves. But when it's getting strong, you can purchase dollars, you can sell rands, and you can seek to at least try and influence it in that manner. but there needs to be agreement at the highest level here between the Treasury and the Reserve Bank on the costs associated with that kind of intervention. But I think that we're coming around to the point that the benefits are greater than the costs of that kind of asymmetrical management. When the exchange rate is getting too strong, we might need to manage it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point to reflect on, because I think sometimes in the public understanding, it's often said that the interest rate is weakening, and you think weak or bad and strong, positive, whereas actually strength might also come with its cost that you might want to intervene. So I think that's a very important point to bring across. Yes, Jordan, I wanted to come back to you because I feel like we're restraining you a bit in the debate. So opening it up in terms of course, we have this policy path. We have fiscal consolidation happening on the one side. We have monetary policy that's very much orthodox. But perhaps paint a picture for us of what the alternative view would be, or the alternative management, putting aside what we have now. But what kinds of things do you think should come more to the fore if we had to, say, have a blank page and start afresh?
So just quickly paint a different national or global economic alternative. Let me just give that a whirl. I think as a start, the discussion has to move, and the economy has to move beyond one of this endless cycle of consumption and exploitation. And growth is based on consumption, and it's consumption of oftentimes resources. And if we slow down this consumption, we slow down growth, and then there's slower job growth, and there's unemployment, political unrest, but it's a completely unsustainable system. So to try and move beyond it is to actually say you have to scrap it entirely. Like there is no mild fixing it. There's no if we tweak it here, it can render a more stable country where there's a little bit of better economic growth. We can eke out the job target this year, but next year we'll miss it. Then there'll be a crisis somewhere else that'll affect our economy nationally. It's absolutely unsustainable. And if people are saying sincerely, what is an alternative? It's real political will and courage to propose something that isn't just a mild tweak of the existing system. Should we have a higher inflation band target? Should we aim for this kind of economic growth? When in reality, it doesn't change the nature of the lives of the majority of people in South Africa, and we'll never do that. So I'm ill-qualified to suggest what is the best alternative economic system for the country, but I think one that doesn't involve heavy exploitation, one that involves creating heavier taxation, particularly of energy companies, so that you can have a base to say, well, how do you move towards some kind of sustainable future that has a way of generating food or water done currently? And it's a very, very tough question for me to try and answer now in this 2 minutes or so that I have.
Okay, but I think we do get a picture that what most concerns you is what would make sense for the great majority of people, and I suppose getting out of a very consumption-driven growth model. I'm going to put it to the other two gentlemen also. If you did think about something that would impact the majority of the population, wondering of monetary policy, what is it that we're getting wrong? Because clearly the majority of the population are still excluded from growth and decent standards of living. So maybe Kenneth, coming to you on that.
Well, my heart is very much with Yashodhan, and my head is very much with Arnold. And I need to find a middle path between the two of them. I would say, for me, the thing, if we could get our democratic state to work, that would change people's lives. The developmental state vision is still one which attracts. If the fiscal policy would allow us to deliver the transformation of education and health and municipal services, and we could tax the rich and make sure that services are effective for the poor. That would change the structure of opportunity that existed in South Africa. That would change the structure of opportunity. And that would be the most decisive intervention for me. Over a few years, maybe a generation, we would find people having their lives in a much better state than they are now. They wouldn't be living in shacks. They wouldn't be uneducated. They would be serviced when they go to the hospitals. That is the vision for me.
But Kenneth, I just want to respond there. But Kenneth, inherent into a market economy is greed. And, that is the nature of it. It promotes growth. It's just there, and it's part and parcel of it. You can't say if we could just do these things differently, it would change everything work. But you can't do it like that in an economy. You can, in this kind of economic system, you can increase the education budget endlessly, and there'll still be massive corruption, because the nature of it is that into our officials, into us as citizens and individuals, it breeds the need to consume almost endlessly. It breeds a I suppose, desire to go towards the part of your humanity, not the highest part of your humanity. So those things that you're doing, that you're talking about, can't really effectively be put into place under this kind of economic system. You'll just get marginal improvements all the way. It's never be radical.
Maybe I'm an optimist. You can call me an optimist. I agree that people are greedy, but that's why we have the law, and that's why we have the state, and that must be the way. When the law and the state are working and corruption is rooted out, that is the way we will change people's lives.
Yeah. But the law is subject to elected officials and to policy, which is influenced by capital. You need money to campaign. All those things don't operate in isolation. So the laws are really only the laws for those who don't have power to move beyond the law. It's a construct, and it's not one anywhere that is able to be defended against real wealth or real power, real wealth or real capital. So, our government there, and every government in the world, they are known corrupt officials who do not get put away because they're known corrupt businesses and businessmen who don't get put away because they have access to capital and access to power. So laws are subject to power and money. It's not the other way around.
Okay, but I think touching on that, and maybe I'll draw you, Arnold, on it, because I think we've moved from the economy being driven.
Yeah, sorry.
And which is fine, and we agree that there are constraints by the law, but you're arguing that law reflects, obviously, once again, dominant interest. But I suppose then doesn't that then take us to just the nature of democracy, in terms of then ensuring that laws are appropriate and work for the majority of the people? Isn't that maybe perhaps then going to have understanding whether the problem is about strengthening just the overall framework of democracy? Arnold, I don't know if you've got any thoughts there.
Yeah. I have to agree with Kenneth that we can't try to pursue perfection. There will always be corruption. There will always be human imperfection, and the best we can do is put in place economic institutions and political institutions. But generally speaking, like Douglas North spoke about it, institutions are human constructions that constrain human behavior. Put those things in place, and I think it's been adequately found that it's the quality of a country's institutions that drive its economic development. So yes, I think Kenneth's point is well taken. And when it comes to democratic institutions, I think the Reserve Bank is the most undemocratic institution you can find. It is serving the interests of a small group of people. It's clearly taking the argument that we know better than the rest of the country, and we have the expertise. Monetary policy is merely a technical matter. It's completely welfare neutral. In fact, it's not welfare neutral. It has strong income redistribution effects. It is clearly a political matter. And I'm not sure if you can make the case, if you want a democratic country, to have a central bank that is not really under any democratic institutions' real control, except for maybe accounting to Parliament once a year and making the odd MPC speech.
Okay, so Arnold, just to clarify that, I mean, because of course there's the imperative of independence, which comes into, I mean, how would that figure then if you had greater democratic oversight?
I think the argument for independence is overrated. I think the literature shows a weak positive correlation, but certainly not a completely strong one. And independence as it is now is really a compromise, because the central banks of the world know they need to have some credibility with the population. So instead of pursuing complete goal independence, which is what they really want, they settle for instrument independence. So they allow the government to set the goal for them as long as they have freedom to do whatever they want in pursuit of that goal. But still the government buys into the same economic thinking as the central bank. So where is the say of the population in the things that really affect us? It's not there. And I think Joseph Stiglitz has made similar points in his research, that if you want to, you have to be consistent in your beliefs. If you believe in democracy, you cannot. It's kind of inconsistent to have a completely independent central bank with that. A central bank is very much a autocratic, dictatorial kind of institution. It's much more in line and aligned with a autocratic political system. So I mean, you have to decide if you want consistency of beliefs or whether you want your beliefs to be inconsistent. And there's clear inconsistency here between the politics and the economics.
Okay. So I'm going to work towards closing remarks, but I think, of course, you've raised some very provocative questions, and I'm going to try and structure the closing remarks around that. Because I think in this discussion, of course, there is that idea of central bank independence, but you're saying that, of course, in a society that is democratic, the institution has to be embedded in it. It has to have some direct response to what the population requires. So perhaps I'm going to ask in closing remarks, just to reflect on that. What is your wish list for a central bank in our context? In general, in abstract, if you did have a blank sheet, but then also in remarks, what is your expectations and outlook for this Reserve Bank and kind of our monetary policy framework, which I think, as we said when we started, kind of has served us well within this paradigm. So I'm going to ask those two concluding thoughts. Big picture, if you had to wish for whatever you could get, what kind of central bank and monetary policy would you want? And then just an outlook on monetary policy for the next year or so under the new leadership. I think I'll go with the order. I'll start with, once again, Kenneth, and then I'll go Arnold, and then have Yashoda have the last word. Concluding remarks, Kenneth?
I think in conclusion, I'm hoping that the Reserve Bank will continue to be engaged in the problems of the South African economy as they evolve over time and contribute to solving those problems. I do think I'm comfortable with the fact that it needs to have instrument independence, but I agree that its goal must be democratically set. So there must be, the government must set the goal of inflation targeting, what the target must be, but then it must operate independently of that. And I don't think that is as sharp a contradiction as is suggested previously by Arnold. I think also that South Africa, the point that Arnold makes is our institutions, the quality of our institutions is crucial, whether it is our parliament or our public protector or what the Deputy Chief Justice has been writing about regarding the centralization of power. All of those issues, we need to resolve them correctly, and the Reserve Bank is one of those institutions. The fiscal policy, they're all different parts of that. If we can get our institutions working properly to represent the will of the people and the interests of the majority, then I think our economy will get onto the right track again.
Thanks, Kenneth. We'll go to Arnold. Closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. I think my wish list would be for some fresh thinking. I think we have seen too much of a repeating of the same old ideas over and over and over again in the last couple of decades. I think economics is not known for its new ideas, and yet the field of monetary policy is full of new ideas. Most of them are completely excluded from the media. I think some of the most interesting thinking I've come across is from modern monetary theory, which shows that the central banks, as they stand at the moment, completely misunderstand the nature of money in a sovereign fiat money system. So, and that involves, so it also speaks to fiscal policy, but all of this nonsense about austerity and budget deficits being too high is completely misguided because the nature of money is misunderstood. So I'd be looking for more of that kind of thinking, but I know the central bank is very protective of their ideas, and they very much don't like that kind of thinking because obviously they have an interest to serve. They've got a group to speak to. They're trying to gain confidence in the international markets, and we have to be realistic. If you want to operate in the international markets, you've got to some degree think like they think, or at least create that impression. I think going forward, it looks like interest rates are going to go up. So I suppose if you have a nice, comfortable savings account, if the bank calls you and asks you to lock in the interest rate, don't, because interest rates are going to go up. And if you need to borrow money very soon, make sure you're trying to fix your interest rate now, because interest rates are going to go up and loans are going to become more expensive.
Thanks, Arnold. Very practical advice. Sheldon, we'll have the final word from you.
Well, I think Arnold made a good point about there's an inconsistency between democracy and having an independent reserve bank. I don't think that's always been the case. If you go back historically, I think that's something that has come up. The US led that move from the early 30s to separate out the government from the reserve bank, and that has created a lot of issues. So my thinking is that either say we are on two different divergent and reserve bank, or consolidate it into one thing and say the reserve bank becomes a direct arm of government policy. My wish list for the following year is to say a well-led revolution. I don't think anything else is too interesting. For myself, lower repo rates means higher borrowing, higher spending. From an investment perspective, that's great. But from a personal perspective, I would lead with the first statement.
Okay, thanks very much to Sheldon, Kenneth, and Arnold. I think it was a great hangout. As always, I think technology is one of those things we have to get on top of, and I'm always glad to have these kinds of alternative settings to debate issues. So I apologize for any, where there were audio and visual issues, but I think we all had interesting things to say and interesting things to learn from this. I mean, we started with a very, conventional, discussion of monetary policy and the Reserve Bank, and I think it's been very enlightening. At the same time, I think we've also put forward alternatives, for our audience to think about, and a different way to thinking about these issues, because we often always just focus on the repo rate announcement and following that slavishly. So I think it's always important that we have moments like these where we can step back and perhaps sometimes wish for a revolution, as some have expressed. So thanks very much, and I'll be hopefully carrying on this discussion on Twitter, and hopefully I'll also be talking to you guys soon. So thank you very much for this hangout.
Thank you.
Thanks, Trudi.